Please consider becoming a patron of Myth Vision Podcast. You'll get early access to every video, including this amazing one, and you can ask me personal questions, private message me, anything you'd like. Professor Elaine Pagels, Orthodoxy seems to think straight. You gotta think like us, but it's about beliefs and what beliefs are true, what beliefs are right.
Right.
Can you tell us more about this?
That's such an important question, Derek, when you're thinking about the beginning of Christianity, because a lot of religious traditions don't focus on belief. It's only because Christianity is the largest religious tradition in the world, the widest, the most people, that we think of religions as being about belief. I mean, doesn't it seem natural? You say, well, what do Jews believe? What do Muslims believe? That's not the question they used to ask. Because these were not sets of beliefs, doctrines. These were ways of life, right? These were ways to act. Like Judaism, if you ask someone who's Jewish, you could say, what do you believe? Because they're used to that question now, because by comparison with Christianity, and there are beliefs. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, right? That's primary prayer. But if you're talking to someone, a devout Jew, you'll say, are you Orthodox or Reform or conservative? In other words, do you eat kosher food, or how careful are you about kosher? How do you practice? Would you, for example, only marry a Jew, or could you marry a Gentile? I mean, it's about your way of life. It's how observant are you? How strict are you about dietary laws and about sexual laws within the group? It's not about belief so much. And the same is true of Islam. Islam is submission to the will of Allah. It's, that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. That's basic. But primarily it's you pray 4 times a day, you eat certain foods, you don't drink alcohol, there are just ways to be a Muslim, ways to be Jewish, ways to be a Buddhist that are not primarily sets of beliefs. So I think I get I may be misunderstood if I say belief is overrated, because I don't think it doesn't matter. But I just mean that religions don't consist primarily of beliefs usually. Christianity made it that because there were so many different interpretations. And that's because there were so many different sources in the early communities that were then sort of, weeded out to the 4 that were most familiar. But then it didn't really work, as you see, because look at Christians today. I mean, all kinds of different groups with different beliefs, with different practices, with different attitudes about food, about sexuality, about alcohol, about relationships, about politics, everything, right? So that's why I think that when we look at these traditions, it's so much more about understanding and ways of life and how we act than it is about belief.
And it makes me think of the creeds, right? So some of these creeds are obviously belief statements,
They are entirely belief statements.
And my question then, so a Christian might be listening to you right now, a fundamentalist, evangelical, or whatever, I don't mean it derogatory, just simply they believe that the Bible is inspired, it's inerrant, it's infallible, every word, jot and tittle, you name it, yada, 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 And they look at Paul and they go, hey, 1 Corinthians 15 seems to be a creedal statement, a belief statement. This is what we believe. Now, some of the scholars I talked to, like Dr. Dennis, not Dr. Dennis, but Dr. Price actually thinks that 1 Corinthians 15 may be an interpolated creedal statement to try and kind of nail down something here. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. You know, at the beginning of 1 Corinthians, Paul says, well, I came to you people and I wanted to teach to you about Christ, but you were such babies. I couldn't tell you. I had to feed you milk. I couldn't give you the meat. I couldn't give you the really solid teachings. I had to start you in very elemental ways. So I came teaching a foolish gospel. I mean, I said, the only thing I'm going to admit around you is Christ crucified, okay? Jesus was crucified. He died for your sins. That's basic, okay? Believe that, and that's enough. That'll save you. So Paul actually in 1 Corinthians says, well, I preach a message. It's a foolish message, but it's all you can handle because you're so immature. First and second chapter of 1 Corinthians. But among the mature people, we do speak wisdom. We speak a different message. We speak a deeper message. But if you want to know what the simple version of it is, look at 1 Corinthians 15, 1-3. You know, we believe that Jesus, was born of a virgin and raised from the dead and died for your sins. That will save you. That's all you need. That's the basics, okay? But Paul also said, I could say a lot more. 1 Corinthians 2, 6 and 7. Among the mature, we teach the wisdom of God, the divine secrets hidden in a mystery before the universe for our glory. But I'm not going to tell you that because you're just psychic Christians. You're not spiritual. And those things have to be taught by the Spirit. So Paul had different ways of teaching. And I think that 1 Corinthians 15, 1-3 is what he thought of as, okay, the bare bones, basic, simple version. That's what I can give you. Because I don't write down the deeper teachings. In fact, because Paul, like other Jews, understood that you're not supposed to write down mystical teachings. Because, as we said, they can be misunderstood by immature people who suddenly get their heads inflated with ideas of they understand God and all the mysteries and somehow they're now weirdly powerful and they go off and they can be kind of crazy. Mm-hmm. So you can't talk that way to people until they're more spiritually mature. And when you do, you have to know that they're ready. But you don't write it in a letter to them because anybody can read that. You have to keep that secret and teach it, as Paul says, we speak that. We don't write it down.
It's interesting you say that because Paul was under a lot of pressure often. His letters
very much so
shine with it big time. I'm not a liar. I lie not. Obviously someone's saying you are, and so he's defending himself. And then it goes further because then he gets borderline what you just said, right? Close to wanting to say more, but he says, I knew a man once.
Yes. Yeah, he had revelations from the Spirit, right? I'm not going to tell you he was taken up into paradise, but
he even
I can't talk about that.
Right, it's someone else. I knew a man.
There's somebody, Very different from the author of the Apocalypse of John, who said, well, I was taken up too, and this is what I was told. But Paul says, no, I was told things that you weren't supposed to say. And those are the secret teachings.
And that's what I think is interesting is that he comes so close, but he doesn't say. And he's doing it in defense too, in a sense. I think he's trying to say, like, I am an authority, I'm somebody important. I always sound with my accent with a D. He's someone special, and he is arguing against what I think are the other apostles, the ones that are Peter and James. And
yes, he is. But I do think he's also saying, okay, but there are different ways to understand the gospel, and if you're immature, I'm going to give you the basics. You stop at that, and you can formulate that. Jesus died for your sins, raised from the dead. He doesn't say how raised. He doesn't say in the body. He doesn't say in a vision. He just says raised from the dead. That's basic.
Yeah, because if you run to, I asked this to Dr. Bart Ehrman, and said, raised from the dead, he goes, what's dead? Dead's dead, right? But he made it sound like the way they would have understood that would have been a physical resurrection, or at least the expectation of resurrection that was supposed to come would have been physical. That's what makes the most sense in terms of dead is dead. But we have apotheosis. We have people who die and ascend after their death, and Jesus is a perfect example of something like this, I think. And I have very good scholar friends. They don't run off into fringe, crazy ideas. Like one of my good friends who's studying this, he's doing an actual presentation on apotheosis and the resurrection of Jesus. And he found there are patterns, there are parallels, that it's not Xerox, it's not a copy, like, oh, this is exactly... The theme of apotheosis seems to be a very common and a well-known established thing, that they're resurrected from the dead in some sense, but it's not that they physically necessarily rose. They ascend to the high heavens, if you will. And Paul might be thinking the same thing.
Well, very mysterious things happen when people die. In Buddhist traditions, too, there are many stories about great teachers and the Buddha who appear, not physically, who are seen after they have died and so forth. And some scholars that I know, like Dale Allison at Princeton Theological Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary, is suggesting that he and many people have experiences seeing people who have died, speaking with them, interacting with them. This is not an uncommon event. Many people who are widowed, people who experience sudden loss of somebody they love, say they have seen that person in some way, or heard the voice, or had a sense of their presence. So it seemed like a much more open question at that time. And Paul, I think, he simply says, I believe Jesus died for your sins and is raised from the dead. That's the basic message. But it's not all he can tell you. He's not going to tell you the rest, just as you said. He said, I can't tell you what came in revelations and visions. What happened there, I'm not going to talk about that.
Not lawful.
But there was secret teaching, and that's why people that were later called Gnostics felt that Paul was absolutely a mentor, because he understood that there were elementary teachings and advanced level teachings.
Meat and milk. Thank you, Dr. Pagel.